Welcome back to Gimme Some Truth. Today I am in the booth with Stan and Sil, two members of our international team that services people that when they move abroad. And today we are talking about common mistakes when people move to Europe. Yes, there are mistakes people make when they move abroad. We can hopefully cover some of those topics today, and hopefully give you resources for additional information specific to your situation should you be contemplating a move to Europe. Stan, what is the most common that you see when you talk to people when they're kind of thinking about moving to Europe, and you have to go, hold on a second, let's think about this a little differently?
Well, I mean, so broadly speaking, like, when people reach out to us before they move to Europe, why that's so super helpful as opposed to once they've gone is just making sure that that the custodial account situation is, that they have the right custodian for the type of accounts that they're going to need, the type of investments that they're going to need, and that we'll be able to, smoothly execute strategies for them because they're in the right place.
In terms of where their money sits now.
Yeah.
In the States,
exactly.
Versus when they're going to move.
Because it's true, like oftentimes people there's two mistakes that they can make is they think they're moving to Europe so they can just take their money with them and move everything over to Europe, or they think that whatever setup they have in place in the US is going to just continue as usual. And oftentimes, neither of those assumptions are accurate.
Yeah, I think that's a great point, Sil, and it's even can potentially be more granular than that, even in terms of like what they own in those specific accounts. And I guess maybe the prevailing statement in this whole podcast is going to be very careful with assumptions, right?
Absolutely.
Because what flies here may not fly in Europe. So we've broken this up into three different kind of categories we want to cover today. The first being kind of what we call special account types, or just what kind of account are we talking about? Is it a brokerage account? Is it a Roth IRA? Is it a 529? Is it an UGMA account? Stan, what are some common kind of pitfalls, things that can trip people up in regard to how their accounts are titled?
Okay, well, so sorry, I kind of really jumped to number 3 first as opposed to number 1.
You're good.
But
we roll with it here.
Let's talk. Let's talk about U.S. specific account structures, right? Let's talk about the Section 529 education savings plans.
Sure.
Right? Or the UTMA Uniform Transfer of to Minors Act or Uniform Gift to Minors Act accounts, custodial accounts that you set up for your little ones.
Yeah.
Right? The 529 is, understand this, okay? And this takes me back to law school, but hopefully I can explain it like you didn't go to law school. If you gift something to somebody, can you take it back 5 years later, 20 years later? Can you gift it to somebody and then down the line say, sorry, you don't need it. I'm going to give it to your sister.
Sure.
Right?
Right.
And the answer is no.
Sure.
Okay, so how is this a completed gift under U.S. law? It's a completed gift under U.S. law because Congress created Section 529, right? How many parliaments in Europe were watching C-SPAN and said, oh, this is a great idea. Voila. 529 plan. No, none of them, right? So what you have here is an account that you manage and transactions take place in these, and many of these rebalance automatically on like a specific date, like the date it was set up, or the anniversary date of that, or the anniversary of the kid's birthday, or whatever. Under U.S. law, this is a tax-deferred account.
No problems.
Okay? Like, under what other circumstances can I give money to you, Nate? Let's just say that, by some miracle, you beat me at golf or something. I owe you
$2. Not often, but yes.
I mean, is that money I give to you? Is that going to grow tax deferred? No. Right? If you use it for educational purposes, does it come out tax-free? No. Right? So in these other countries, the idea of, well, this is an educational account and it grows tax deferred, and if you use it for specific schools that are on the federal student loan program, then it's tax-free. Or if I use it for room and board, or if I use it to buy an Apple notebook for my kids too, maybe that counts. But like, these are very specific U.S. rules. They're not European rules, guys. So the 529 in particular causes the greatest potential nightmare, right? Because anybody that goes to Europe or anybody that's been in Europe and they got the 529, they're never thinking about this. This account goes on, and they may not be reporting it to the tax authorities there, but are they legally required to report it to the tax authorities there? Yeah, probably, right?
I think that you bring up a great point, and that's we in this country use the kind of the language of our industry in almost kind of a flippant way, right? 529, 401k, 403b, 457, right? These are all they harken back to tax codes, right? Within the tax laws.
Yes.
U.S. tax laws. So again, sounds obvious, but let's talk a little bit about why that matters so much. That's U.S. tax law. That's not world tax law, right?
No, absolutely. It means that, simply put, every time you're looking at a specific type of U.S. account, you have to start thinking, okay, how will my new country of residence look at that particular account? And the 529 was worth spending a bit of time on because it's a great example of something that people just assume is going to work just fine, yet isn't. But really, you have to think along the same lines with every single account, right? I mean, you have to think about IRAs. You have to, in some cases, think about trusts. You have to think about joint accounts. You have to start asking those questions for every single type of account.
And preferably before you move.
Ideally, yes.
Yeah. I mean, because, the fix for this may just be, well, grandma and grandpa are still here in the States, and it doesn't create a tax burden for them to be the official owners of the account or the director of these kids, custodial accounts. Maybe we'll just switch ownership over to, somebody in the family or some really close friend that you absolutely trust, because they would have the authority to even pull it out for their own. So, obviously you want to be very careful when you do this, but getting this off the table for you can dramatically, decrease your potential accounting and tax legal issues while you're living abroad.
And we see this all the time. Right.
Yeah.
This is not an isolated incident.
Yeah.
This is not for a small pie. This is all we see this all the time.
And younger clients of mine that are already abroad, they ask for these sometimes, or they mention it. Should we be doing a 529? And then I almost uniformly have to say, absolutely not.
Yeah.
Right.
Yeah.
Does your country have a tax code?
Does it have 529?
If the answer is yes, probably not.
Yeah.
Right.
Let's dovetail this into retirement plans, retirement accounts, legacy accounts. I'm moving to France or Germany or Italy. And I have a 401k and it's got, 500,000 in it. I just roll that over and we're good, right?
Yeah. I mean,
maybe.
Right? So, I mean, here's where, I think, for the most part, in Europe, like a 401k versus an IRA, there may not be a lot of legal distinction, right? There are some countries that don't like rolling over, right? But,
What's an example?
Nobody in Europe seems to just...
Sweden doesn't like that idea.
Yeah. So, I mean, there can be a distinction. Right?
Sure.
So rolling over certainly is a non-taxable event in the U.S., and there are rules on a direct rollover or an indirect rollover that you have to follow. They're U.S. rules, right? Following the U.S. rules doesn't necessarily lead to the same outcome in a foreign country. I mean, that does seem obvious, but most people completely neglect to to incorporate that in their investment strategies when they're doing it themselves.
Yeah, and I think to be clear too,
Or if they're working with just a domestic advisor that doesn't, think about these things.
Sure.
Right?
Or just working with a European advisor that doesn't think about it from a U.S. side.
Yeah.
It kind of goes both ways. So what are, I think it's such a complex topic, and we're saying Europe as a singular thing, right? But as you alluded to with Sweden, the rules amongst the countries that make up Europe, even though European Union ties a lot of them together, it can be shockingly different from one country to another.
They vary dramatically. I mean, you have a completely separate tax code. There is no unified European set of tax rules, right? So it's true that we're speaking very broad terms here in terms of moving to Europe, but every country is going to be different. And it's true that some of the assumptions we make about the UK may not apply to France and may not apply to Spain. So it gets even more granular and even more complicated when you look at it on a country-by-country basis. So here we're trying to highlight the risks and the questions you need to ask, but there's a deeper layer of due diligence here that's needed depending on where you're actually moving to.
Recognition of tax deferral is essentially a treaty benefit, right? You won't necessarily have it unless, pensions are covered in the treaty,
right,
so to speak. And every treaty is potentially different, but the U.S. does operate on a template when they went out and negotiated treaties. But remember also, some of these treaties may be 40 years old and some may be 5 years old.
Exactly.
They may be redone
and
or
can
whatever.
change.
Yes.
And even the interpretation of the treaty under local law can change, because the issue with Sweden, for example, is not that there isn't a treaty with Sweden. There is a treaty. It's just that one day a Swedish court decided that, hey, this is what pension means under our law, and this or that type of account does not meet the requirement. So it gets you can't just read the treaty and assume.
And I think you can point back to the U.S., for example, distribution age of IRAs, 70.5 for a long, long time. Now it's 73, goes up to 74 in a handful of years. It's a good example that, to Sill's point, their Congresses, their governments, their court systems can make these changes, or the treaty can get renegotiated and also make these changes.
Yeah,
absolutely.
One important common treaty feature shows up in the paragraph on government service.
Yeah.
Okay. And that provision, that article has two important parts, right? The first part is that remuneration from one country's government or any subdivision thereof, meaning state and local, right? Payable to a resident of the other country is only taxed in that first country, right? If you work for IBM in France, that doesn't apply, right? IBM is owned by the government now, probably, but in some ways. But essentially, that's private, and wherever you are living and working, that country, of course, can tax your wages, but not if it is a public entity, is your employer, right? And then the second paragraph, and this is the important thing about the rollover or don't rollover, is that a pension that was set up by that governmental entity in relation to employment benefit, that pension from a public entity is only taxable in the country of that government, right? So if you have, imagine that you are a retired federal employee and you have a TSP through a savings plan. If you don't know what that is, it's like the 401k for the gov, for the big feds, right? If you roll that over into an IRA, it's no longer it's no longer a government pension, right? It's your own pension. And most countries, and believe it or not necessarily all countries, will just say, well, you lost that treaty benefit.
Sure.
And we're going to tax your distributions from your IRA. Mm-hmm. But if you kept it in a TSP and you've done direct distributions from that to meet your expenses or whatever.
Yeah.
It's just taxed under U.S. tax rates, right? And it's only taxable in the U.S. And by the way, that tends to be throughout most of Europe, certainly Western Europe, to be a much lower rate than you would owe had you done the same thing in your IRA, because European tax rates brackets tend to climb faster and higher.
Which is just a huge distinction, relatively speaking.
Yeah.
So
this can be a huge, I can't emphasize what an important tax savings opportunity it can be to not roll over.
So that's
in
one,
certain circumstances.
and that's just one small example of how you can have drastic and
this would apply to teachers' 401bs and 457s, and it, there are lots of gray areas though. Like if you went to a school that's kind of quasi public, but sort of private, how's that going to be interpreted by that foreign government? It's kind of it's kind of hard to say, but out of an abundance of caution, maybe you preserve the potential to make that treaty claim. By not rolling over, it becomes a moot point once you do.
So as we wrap up today, and this is for sure a topic we're going to come back to and film more on, because I think there's just so many different ways so many different directions we can go with it. But let's conclude today on the actual holdings within a portfolio and why that matters. So I own 10 ETFs in my brokerage account or my Roth IRA or wherever, and I moved to Germany. I'm fine. Well, not necessarily.
You have to be aware of basically the fundamental question is, how is my local country going to treat those investments, right? Are the things that I invest in the US because they work well, they're simple, they're tax efficient, are those properties also going to apply in my new jurisdiction? And in some cases, it's pretty simple and portfolios are fairly portable. But there are cases where countries may have very specific sets of rules about the ways certain types of investments are taxed. And there are countries where investing in U.S. mutual funds or U.S. ETFs can be very inefficient because, for example, the local country only gives you capital gains tax treatment on funds that are registered locally, right? Or funds that are on some sort of pre-approved list that the local tax office publishes, right? So these are not uncommon situations. It applies in the UK, it applies in Austria, it applies in Denmark. So
Italy.
So this is kind of, you have to look at how accounts get treated. And then within the accounts, you have to ask yourself, how will these particular investments be treated?
I think that the overarching theme is whether you work with us, whether you work with somebody else, just make sure that you work with an advisory firm that understands these nuances as closely and as intimately as they possibly can, because you can have just such small distinctions and have that be a massive tax ramification. The guys here at Walker & Condon have been doing this for a long, long time. We also have connections with attorneys in Europe and estate planning attorneys and accountants in Europe that know this stuff as well. And so if you're going to make a move like this, and obviously it's a move that involves 100 different decisions, make sure that you give enough emphasis to this part of your life before you move, because things can be done before you move that can make your life significantly easier and eliminate many, many headaches when you start your new life in Europe. So thank you so much for tuning in today to another episode of Gimme Some Truth.
Walker & Condon Financial Advisors is a registered investment advisor with the SEC. Registration with the SEC does not imply a certain level of skill or training. The opinions expressed by the participants of this podcast are their own and do not reflect the opinions of Walker & Condon Financial Advisors. All statements and opinions expressed are based upon information considered reliable, although it should not be relied upon as such. Any statements or opinions are subject to change without notice. Information presented is for educational purposes only and does not intend to make an offer or solicitation for the sale or purchase of any specific securities, investments, or investment strategies. Investments involve risk and, unless otherwise stated, are not guaranteed. Information expressed does not take into account your specific situation or objectives and is not intended as recommendations appropriate for any individual. Listeners are encouraged to seek advice from a qualified tax, legal, or investment advisor to determine whether any information presented may be suitable for their specific situation. Past performance is not indicative of future performance. Thanks for listening, and for further information, please visit walknercondon.com.